Well, Bill, let's keep you in the hot seat and keep you answering these questions because we've gotten some from all over. These questions interact with your work, with the questions of the week, with the website and your books. From the United States, Parker says, first of all, I just wanted to say how useful your ministry has been to me and the development of my faith. I'm very grateful for all the great work you've done. My question revolves around the nature of the cause of the universe. Accepting that there cannot be an infinite regress of temporal causes, we can conclude that the past must be finite and the universe has a beginning. So, accepting the first two premises of the Kalam, we conclude that the universe has a cause. Upon further examination, we can say that whatever caused the universe, or all physical reality, is eternal and exists by necessity. However, could one object by saying that the cause of all physical reality is not one necessary being or prime mover, but an infinite regress of simultaneous causes? I understand that an infinite regress of temporal causes is impossible, but is it incoherent to posit an infinity of causes that are simultaneous, such as an infinite number of minds contingent on one another that exist outside of physical reality and cause it to exist, as opposed to one necessary being?
So what Parker is imagining is that there could be a sort of timeless stack of causes, like an unending stack of pancakes, so to speak, that would exist timelessly and regress infinitely. Now, if the philosophical arguments that I give against the existence of an actual infinite number of things are sound, then that would rule out such an infinite stack of timeless causes. Moreover, Alexander Proust has just released a book called Infinity, Causation, and Paradox, which I think is probably the most important modern book written on the Kalam Cosmological argument. It is a tour de force. Parts of it are so mathematically complex that you would need to be a trained mathematician to understand them. But in the second chapter of that book, Proust presents arguments against infinite regresses regardless of their order, whether they are chronologically ordered or whether they are timelessly ordered in the sort of stack that we imagine, and gives arguments to say that this sort of infinite regress is impossible. So I would commend the second chapter of Proust's book to Parker. Finally, I would note that Occam's razor, I think, would shave away any additional causes. Occam's razor says that we're justified in postulating only those causes which are necessary to explain the effect. Beyond that, we are not justified in postulating further causes. In other words, do not multiply causes beyond necessity. And one timeless, creative cause is sufficient to explain the origin of the universe, and Occam's razor, therefore, will simply shave away any more.
Next question from the United States. Grant says, "Hi, Dr. Craig. I've been following your writings and debates for a few years now, and I'm a big fan. I'm writing to ask you why you seem to place so much emphasis on the Kalam cosmological argument in arguing for God's existence in comparison to other types of cosmological argument. For instance, Aquinas' argument from efficient causation or various formulations of the contingency argument seem to be completely immune to squabbles about the nature of time or assertions that the universe is eternal, in spite of evidence to the contrary. Is it simply that the Kalam is easier to explain in a limited period of time to a debate audience, or is there something about these other types of arguments that you find to be lacking? Thanks for indulging my curiosity."
Well, I'm not sure if Grant is aware that I have defended the Leibnizian version of the argument from contingency. We've even produced a Zangmeister video on the Leibnizian argument. So I am a fan and supporter of the argument from contingency. But what he says is true. I do like the Kalam argument better. And the reason would be simply because its premises, I think, are so much more plausible and perspicuously true. I think that whatever begins to exist has a cause, is virtually undeniable for any sincere inquirer after truth. And I think that the arguments in support of the second premise, that the universe began to exist, are extraordinarily powerful, both philosophically and scientifically. I know of no other argument for God's existence which has such amply supported premises. And so for that reason, I like the Kalam version of the cosmological argument even better than the Leibnizian version.
Mm-hmm. And it's the one that you really specialized in as well. I mean, as opposed to specializing in all of them.
Well, yes, but Kevin, it's because I found this to be the most persuasive. My doctoral thesis at the University of Birmingham was called The Cosmological Argument, and it included chapters on the Leibnizian version of the argument, as well as the Thomistic version of the argument and the Kalam version of the argument. Now, I published the material on the Kalam version separately as a book, and this became more widely known, but the original doctoral thesis was an examination of all of the various versions of the cosmological argument, and in my studied judgment, the one with the most plausible and perspicuously true premises is the Kalaam argument.
Okay. Related question here, Dr. Craig. It says, "Hey, Dr. Craig, I was wondering something about the cosmological argument and haven't found a suitable answer for my question thus far. It is often espoused that if the conclusion, the universe began to exist, is correct, it would lead to a spaceless, timeless, immaterial, personal, etc., creator of the universe. From what I've seen, the reasoning is usually that whatever creates time, space, and matter must be outside of or not made of space or matter. But would this not also be true of many other things in our universe, like minds or energy, etc.? Could we not say that whatever created mind couldn't have been a mind, etc.? Is it just a case of necessity versus contingency?" Hope that makes sense, Jay.
Well, it's not a case of necessity versus contingency. With respect to mind, the claim is not that the cause of the universe created every mind, because obviously it didn't create itself. What it created was finite minds, and there is an infinite, uncreated mind, which is the cause of the universe. And the argument for that, I give a threefold argument actually, for the cause of the universe being a mind. One is that the only thing that could fit the description of an immaterial, uncaused, timeless, spaceless cause of the universe would be a mind. An abstract object won't fit the bill. The second argument would be only a mind endowed with freedom of the will could explain the origin of a temporal effect from an eternal, timeless, permanent cause. And then the third one would be that in the case of a first physical state of the universe, you cannot have a scientific explanation of the first physical state. You could only have a personal explanation of a first physical state of the universe. And so for all three of those reasons, I think that we are justified in thinking that the cause of the universe is an uncreated mind.
Okay. Next question from the UK. "Hello, Dr. Craig. In your recent excellent podcast, you assent to the view that Luke used the Gospel of Mark as a source for his, or Luke's, own gospel. However, Luke declares in 1:1, inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile an account, it seemed good to me also. The word for undertaken here implies previous, non-success in other uses being Acts, in its other uses being Acts 9:29, but they were attempting to put him to death. And Acts 19:13, some of the Jewish exorcists attempted to name over those who had the evil spirits the name of the Lord Jesus. Using this internal criteria, does this not imply that Luke was the first gospel? And if you disagree, what do you think are the arguments against such a position?
I don't think that you can use the way the word undertaken might be used in other places to imply non-success. Luke is simply saying that he is aware that there are other gospels that have been written. Now, insofar as his word choice might be taken to imply a deficiency in these other accounts, it's interesting that what Luke says is that inasmuch as many others have undertaken to write an account of what's transpired among us, I too have attempted to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus. And it's made me wonder whether or not Luke might have known Matthew's gospel, because Matthew's gospel lumps different episodes in Jesus' life together thematically rather than chronologically. And it made me wonder whether Luke might not have found this rather disorderly, and so he wants to write a more orderly account in his gospel. So far from implying that Luke is the first gospel, it would suggest that there were prior gospels to Luke, which he's used, and it could even include the Gospel of Matthew. Robert Gundry, a very fine New Testament scholar, has shown that many Matthean peculiarities, that is to say, vocabulary that is unique to Matthew, get reproduced in Luke, which suggests that, in fact, Luke and Matthew were not simply independently using Mark, but that Matthew may have used Mark, and Luke used Matthew as well as Mark, and hence you have these Matthean peculiarities appearing in Luke. Now, I'm not in a position to endorse that view, but I think it's certainly possible and intriguing.
This question, Dr. Craig, also from the UK, says, "Hi, I've been reading your book On Guard and have found it an enormous help. Thank you. I have a question on Leibniz's argument, but unfortunately I do not study philosophy, and whilst I think the answer exists in your existing Q&A, I have not been able to find it or understand it. You state that the universe does not exist necessarily because it would be possible for a different set of fundamental particles to exist. What is the basis on which we can say that it is possible for other fundamental particles to exist? Thank you very much for your help and the insight your books and website offer."
Well, thank you, Chris, for your question. The argument here is that it's evident as we look out at the universe that these physical things that comprise the universe don't have to exist. They're not metaphysically necessary. Things like planets and dust clouds and radiation and galaxies, they didn't have to exist with a sort of metaphysical necessity. And what the atheist might say is, well, all right, it's true that those things didn't need to exist, but maybe the matter out of which those things are made had to exist necessarily. And so he will move beyond the galaxies, the planets, the dust clouds, radiation, right down to the matter itself and say matter exists necessarily. And then my riposte to that is to say that matter is itself composed of fundamental particles like electrons and quarks. And so on this view, you would have to say that every single fundamental particle, every quark, every electron in the universe is a metaphysically necessary being. And that, to me, just seems outrageous. So the answer to Chris is that it simply seems preposterous intuitively to think that every single quark in the universe is a metaphysically necessary being that could not have failed to exist.
Okay. Next question. Hi, Dr. Craig. I appreciate all of your work and taking time to defend theism in a world where it feels threatened. I've been reading a little about your work on philosophy of time, and I still am failing to understand a couple of points.
All right, let's take them one at a time.
Okay. You said in a talk in 2012 that the Kalam Cosmological argument, particularly the first premise, relies on a theory of time, But in your recent podcast, Science and the A Theory of Time, you noted that only one argument, the inability to form an actual infinite by successive addition, for one, the second premise, relies on A theory. Can you reconcile this?
So what we're talking about here is whether or not the Kalam Cosmological argument relies upon a certain theory of time according to which the distinction between past, present, and future is real, not illusory. A view of time according to which things really do come into being and then go out of being. And I've had something of a change of mind on this that is represented by these two different answers. In the earlier answer, it seemed to me that the causal principle, whatever begins to exist as a cause, is rooted in this theory of time, that something cannot come into being without a cause. And that is, in fact, the reason, personally, why I think the first premise is true, because I presuppose that dynamic view of time, and I think it's impossible for something to come into being, come to exist without a cause. But since then, a number of philosophers have pointed out to me that so-called B theorists, those who think that past, present, and future are equally real, and that temporal becoming is just an illusion of human consciousness, would be no more sympathetic to uncaused events than would be the atheist. For example, suppose at T1 my living room is empty, and at T2 there's a horse in my living room. The B theorist would not at all be sympathetic to saying that that horse began to exist at T2 with no cause whatsoever. That would be absurd to think that at T1 there could be no horse and at T2 there could be a horse in my living room. And that seems to me to be right. I think that that is intuitively the case, even on a B theory. So even though my own reasons for believing the causal premise are grounded in the A theory, and I think make it all the more perspicuous, it probably is the case that B theorists would be equally sympathetic to the truth of the first premise.
Okay. His second question is, what is the relationship between the Neo-Lorentzian interpretation and the A theory and the Kalam cosmological argument? Does the Neo-Lorentzian interpretation support either?
Now here we need to give a little background for our listeners. There are three different physical interpretations of the mathematical equations of the special theory of relativity. One was the initial interpretation given by Einstein in his 1905 paper. This posited three-dimensional objects which endure through time and suffer various deformations as a result of relative motion. This view was superseded in 1908 by Hermann Minkowski's four-dimensional space-time interpretation, according to which objects are actually four-dimensional, 3 dimensions of space, and they are extended in 1 dimension of time, so that reality is a tenseless, static, changeless entity, a kind of four-dimensional space-time object. And that has come to be the dominant presentation of the theory in physics textbooks today, not the original Einstein interpretation. Yet a third interpretation was offered by Einstein's contemporary and collaborator, H.A. Lorentz, the great Dutch physicist. And what Lorentz said is that there does exist a preferred reference frame relative to which absolute simultaneity and absolute length exists, but that our clocks and our measuring rods are distorted by their physical motion relative to this fundamental frame. Now, the question is, if the A theory of time is true, that we just talked about a moment ago, if temporal becoming is real and things really do come into being and go out of being, Which of these three interpretations of relativity theory is the most plausible? Well, it cannot be the Minkowskian version, because that is a four-dimensionalist, space-time, changeless model of the world. Things never come into being and go out of being on Minkowski's view. So it's got to be either the original Einstein interpretation or Lorentz's view. But the Einsteinian interpretation would be fantastic, I think, because it would lead to a radical fragmentation of reality. If you and I are simply passing each other in motor cars or even bicycles, we will literally inhabit different space and time. And at far enough distances, events will be present for me which are past, say, for you. And reality becomes radically fragmented. And it seems metaphysically implausible that existence and reality could be relative simply to our relative motion with respect to each other. That when we're passing each other in automobiles, we inhabit a different space and time. But if I slow down and we come to be moving in tandem with each other so that we're uniform rest, voila, suddenly we're back in the same time again. That seems just crazy, that reality could be relative to physical motion in that way. So that means that the Neo-Lorentzian interpretation is the most plausible. Given the A theory of time, it seems most plausible to think that Lorentz was right. And this is a viable interpretation of special relativity theory. Indeed, the most recent developments in quantum mechanics have lent strong support to a Neo-Lorentzian version, so that people like the great physicist John Bell, as well as the philosopher of science Karl Popper and others, have said we really need to get back to Lorentz if we're going to make sense out of these quantum mechanical experiments.
Okay. He asks one more question. He says, how do you explain curvature of light without a view of gravity as a curvature of space-time? I've had a physics professor explain curvature of light for that reason when I asked how gravity can pull light when photons have no mass.
The alternative way of viewing gravitation would be not as a warping or curvature of space-time, but rather as a fundamental force, akin to the strong force or the weak force or the electromagnetic force. These are the fundamental forces of nature. And although gravitation is often treated geometrically, it can be treated as a fundamental force instead. And indeed, Steven Weinberg has said that construing gravity as a deformation of space-time, as warping of space-time, actually inhibits the drive to find a unified theory of physics in which the four fundamental forces of nature could be united in a single force carried by a single particle. So there's no need to buy into the gratuitous metaphysics of four-dimensional space-time and to think of gravitation in terms of the curvature of space-time.
Bill, we have a question today. It's our final question from Saudi Arabia. Nasser says, as a 17-year-old and being Saudi Muslim born, you inspired me to not only study philosophy but also Christian theology. My question is regarding the problem of evil and suffering. In your article regarding the problem of evil and suffering, you write that the logical problem of evil fails because there is some implicit contradiction that no philosopher has ever been able to bring out. But from my reading, it appears that Mackey's essay, Evil and Omnipotence, clearly identified the so-called hidden premises. Mackey writes, and I quote, however, the contradiction does not arise immediately. To show it, we need some additional premises, or perhaps some quasi-logical rules connecting the terms good, evil, and omnipotent. These additional principles that good is opposed to evil in such a way that a good thing always eliminates evil as far as it can, and that there are no limits to what an omnipotent thing can do. From these, it follows that a good omnipotent thing eliminates evil completely. And then the propositions that a good omnipotent thing exists and that evil exists are incompatible. My question here is about your response to Mackey. It appears to me, and I am no philosopher yet, that Mackey clearly identified the hidden premises within the logical problem. And if correct, then Mackey's argument will act as a strong proof against God, Dr. Craig. Will you answer this? Many thanks and kind regards.
Well, I want to really thank Nasser for his question. It's a thrill to me to receive a question from Saudi Arabia and know that we have Muslim listeners. When I said, Nasser, that no one has been able to successfully identify the hidden premises that would bring out the contradiction between God's existence and the existence of evil, what I meant was that nobody has been able to successfully identify these premises. But obviously, Mackey has tried to do so. What you need to look at is Alvin Plantinga's refutation of Mackey's attempt to identify those premises. You can find this either in Plantinga's book, The Nature of Necessity, in the chapter on the problem of evil, or in his more popular level book, which is called God, Freedom, and Evil. And if you are a beginner in philosophy, you might want to begin with that latter book, God, Freedom, and Evil. And what Plantinga shows is that, in fact, Mackey has some fallacious assumptions that he makes, and therefore his attempt to identify the hidden premises fails. And I think it's widely acknowledged that Plantinga has successfully refuted Mackey in this.